indentured servants, when they would come to America, what country were they typically coming from? What? England. Okay, that's not just Europe, but England more specifically. Not that they didn't come from other places, but we're looking at mainly English servants coming to be in the English colonies. And what color were they? White. That's very important. Typically speaking, an indentured servant was white. Now, there is some records that would indicate that there might have been some blacks that were used as indentured servants at the beginning. So it's not impossible that blacks were not also used that way and could actually earn their freedom after working there 4 to 7 years. But typically they were white. So if that's true, if most of our labor in the colonies in the first 75 years or so was from indentured servants, then why did we switch to black African slaves? Okay, so part of it was they were deemed to be able to live longer. See that?
Slow down. It wasn't paying.
Why?
It wasn't paying.
What? Yeah, that's really the key to it. Why would you risk your life to come over here to this very difficult place and have to give up 4 to 7 years of your freedom, and then 40% of them typically died in servitude? Why would you be willing to do that if you had a good job back in England? If life was comfortable back there, it's kind of pointless. But the people who were coming here to begin with, generally speaking, were coming because life wasn't good in England. When they, in the early years, they would come because things weren't good in England. It was hard to get decent jobs. It was hard to get land. That was really the key because most people in this time period were farmers. And if you don't have land, you can't farm. So here, what does America have that England doesn't have? For the most part, lots of land. But they don't have laborers. So you can come here, you put in your 4 to 7 years, you're lucky you survive. 60% of them survive. It doesn't mean you're going to get a piece of land for free, but if you were lucky, you could have worked. In that 4 to 7 year period, people actually made money. They would have to work for the person that they were contracted to, but they could also make money on the side. And so some of them were able to earn enough money, save enough money in their 4 to 7 years to be able to buy it. Now, that wasn't the majority of them, but it could happen. So you've got these people that when things aren't good back in England, they're willing to come. However, when the conditions improved in England, why would you do that? It's very risky. Just to say, well, I've got 3 out of 5 chances of even living to get through this security services. You're not going to do that. You've got to do something back home. So that's really the key to what happens. As things get better in England, and as things get better there, they're not willing to come. Plus, what's happening on the other end in terms of African slaves? But prices are going down. Why would that happen? Supply has increased. Why is supply increased? There's a lot more competition. See, in the beginning, for at least the English colonies, it was kind of a monopoly. There was one company that basically had a monopoly. But as that monopoly was broken and more companies got involved in the slave trading business, the competition is obviously going to be there. You're going to want to sell your slaves, so you might be willing to drop the price, cut through the deal, so the prices of the slaves begin to drop. So at the same time that you can't get white indentured servants, the supply of African slaves is going up and the price is dropping. So, plus they're popular. You give the slaves and you don't have to give them up after 4 to 7 years if they last time. Which here in America they did. Not so much in the Indies. There they tend to get worked to death and they may not last 10 years anyway. Okay, you guys talked about why people would be willing to come here. So what were your, without going into a lot of detail, what were your main reasons as to why people were willing or wanted to come to America? And Dylan, right? Anybody else? Something that I- Okay, so what are the main motivations for people to come to America? Religious persecution, right? Who was persecuting whom?
Charles.
I don't need you to get into specifics as far as names of kings and stuff like that, but what groups were being persecuted? Now, why would Puritans be persecuted if England is an Anglican church? Yeah, but Puritans are Protestants. That makes sense. These are Protestants. So why would Protestants persecute Protestants? What was wrong with this church, according to them? Was the Anglican Church truly Protestant in the way that Martin Luther or John Calvin would have wanted it to be Protestant? What was it? What was it more like? Roman Catholic. It's really a very Catholic kind of church with a Protestant name. They didn't really change anything. They just changed the name of it so King Henry could get his divorce. That wouldn't be too difficult, too complicated to actually change anything. Let's just put a different shingle out there in the front. Now, obviously, over time, it did change. And it's still more, Catholics are considered more high church, more ritual and that kind of stuff. The Anglican Church is still a high church, but it's a Protestant high church. Their doctrine is definitely different than the Catholic Church now. But in terms of the way that they carry out their services, it would still be more similar to a Catholic church. What does this equate to in America? Anglicans in America are called what? I'm being a little simplistic there, but it is pretty. Yeah, Episcopal Church. So here in America, the Episcopal Church is the kind of, what is the descendant, so to speak, of the Anglican Church. And I don't know if any of you are Episcopal or grew up that way, but you probably realize it's still kind of high church. The priests still wear robes. The choir members still wear robes. It's not like a good old Baptist church. They show up in shorts. All right, so you've got the fact that the Puritans didn't think this church was Protestant enough. It really hadn't lost the trappings of the papacy. And so they are constantly nagging at the Anglicans to get things cleaned up, to really become truly a Protestant church. Well, of course, the king, whoever that king might have been at the time, didn't appreciate that. Sometimes the king actually was somebody trying to return the church to Catholicism. So at times you've got a Catholic king that's persecuting the Puritans, but sometimes it is a Protestant king that is persecuting them because they're a pain in the butt. They're annoying. But on the other hand, they're also influential. Many Puritans ended up, they were wealthier, influential people that were, some of them in Parliament, so they had some political power. And that's where I think somebody mentioned Charles I, and that's where you start to get into some of those issues. So who else came here for religious reasons? Catholics, specifically to which colony? Maryland, where they ended up being a minority anyway, because pretty much America, generally speaking, did not like Catholics. There were not many places that you could live in America at this time and be Catholic and actually worship freely. They saw Catholics tied to the Pope, and the Pope would try to control them, so they didn't want that. Who else would come for religious reasons? What? Jews. Again, nobody here likes Jews either, but you might be able to escape the direct persecution that you would get back in Europe, but they still weren't accepted anyway. And somebody else said something. Quakers, where'd they end up? Mostly in Pennsylvania, some in New Jersey, but they didn't do well back in England because they were different. They wouldn't fight. He didn't appreciate them because they weren't willing to fight for him, and they wouldn't pay taxes. At least not taxes to support the Church of England, which was the state-supported church. And that never goes over well. I don't know how many of you have tried not to pay your taxes, but usually authorities do not appreciate that. So they come here so that they can practice their faith. They're probably the only group of people that wanted religious freedom and were also willing to give it. The Puritans wanted religious freedom, but they persecuted everybody else who didn't believe the way they did. But of course, they were right. In their minds, they're not really persecuting anybody, they're right. Everybody else is wrong. So, you've got all of these different groups that come for religious reasons, but is that the only reason why people came to America? What else? Profit, right? They want to make money. Now, some of them hope to find gold and silver just lying on the ground, like the Spanish were lucky enough to do. But that didn't work so well here. So eventually they had to figure out that they had to come up with other ways to make money. And what was one of the first ways they did that? Tobacco. Not so much selling it here, obviously, but selling it back in Europe where it became a huge fad to smoke tobacco. What else became ways for them to make money here? Besides tobacco. Sugar cane, but more in, who's that from? No. What colonies? More in the Caribbean, not so much in America, the mainland. So here in the mainland, what else did we do to make money? What? Cotton. Don't say cotton. Right. We don't talk about cotton yet. Wait till we get past 1700. Yeah, some corn. Rice. Rice becomes the main crop of the South. Tobacco of the Chesapeake. And what did they grow in New England? I don't know. I mean, I guess they would grow some potatoes. I don't know if they grew them as a cash crop. What else? Indigo's in the South. Rice is the #1 crop in the South. Indigo will become the #2 crop. What is indigo? You don't typically eat it, right? It's something you use the blue dye. It's a plant that is used to make a blue dye, which was very popular at this time. What do we grow in New England? Trees. Lumber is one of the main businesses of New England. Lumber mainly to build ships. So shipbuilding becomes a major industry up there. What else do they do in New England to this day? Not yet. I mean, they do, you're right. But I talked of like the earlier years. That will develop. But even when it develops, they struggle. Fishing is big. And that's going to be one of, fishing and timber are probably their two major ways. And there's one other that we've talked about before, along the rivers, little beavers, the fur trade, that's going to be another one. But New England, my point is, New England doesn't really have a cash crop because New England, the geography of it, the topography of it is such that you don't have large farms to be able to grow crops for market. Now everybody grows crops, but they grow them mainly for substance, anyway, to eat. And so they're growing gardens like to feed themselves, and they might have a little bit of extra that they can sell or barter with somebody, but for the most part, farming is not to make money in New England, it's to live. Whereas tobacco and then the rice of the South becomes the way that they actually earn money so that they can then buy food and buy other things that they need. So those kind of become the major money-making opportunities for people here. So people are coming here for religious reasons and for profit. What are they not coming for? Which we usually are told they are coming for. What? Independence. You know, when you're little, you're raised with this idea, you know, you go through elementary school, middle school, and everything else, being told that people left England because England was so horrible, and they came over here to be free, and then, you know, these great people made this wonderful country, and look who we are today. And we're so happy to be here. Okay? Well, some of that's true, but if we go back to what I think I told you guys the first day, maybe not, I might be thinking of my other class. What's this date represent? Can you see that? 1607. And they all said, that's it. Founding of Jamestown. Okay, I'm not going to ask you guys to memorize many dates, but I would like you to kind of get this one stuck in your head. These next two. 1607 is the founding of Jamestown, which is first British colony in America, right? Okay, so what is this date? 1733. What did you say? Good. Founding of the last of the 13, Georgia. Now, look at the difference here. How many years is that? 126 years. My point being, it's not like the 13 colonies were all founded, boom, 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 and all of a sudden you have 13. This is 126 years. This is 3 generations. Being that people in the South only live to be 40 years old. This is a long period of time between the first and the 13th. So the people who came here, especially here in Virginia, Jamestown being Virginia, they were part of, before Georgia was founded, they've been part of America, but yet still part of the English Empire for 125 years. And they hadn't made any talk about wanting to break away from England, wanting to be independent. Georgia surely didn't want to be at this time. And when you're looking at this date, 1733, or even when you get into the 1750s, there's not much talk in America, really hardly any talk, except for by Looney Tunes, people sitting in a bar getting drunk maybe, that are saying that they want to break away from England and be independent. These people are proud to be part of the English Empire. They're proud to call themselves English citizens. They want to look like people back in England. They want to dress like them. They want to have the same stuff that they have. They want to talk the way that they do. They're trying to emulate England. They're not trying to get away from it. Now, this isn't a perfect analogy, but I think of this kind of like, see, and I can say this because I have 2 kids that are away at college. Kids, generally speaking, if they have the opportunity, I know this isn't true of everybody, but if they have the opportunity, would they rather stay home and live with their parents and go to community college or go off to a university? Why? It's not home, right? I mean, most of us don't want to stay home with mommy and daddy when we're 18 to 22 years old. Not because, now what I'm getting at is if mommy and daddy are still going to pay the bill. Okay, where would you rather be? If they're willing to pay for you to go away to that 4-year university, would you rather stay home or go to the university? Not too many people would say stay home with mom and dad. If you do, you're probably a bit strange. and you maybe need to go to counseling. Okay, it's not normal, generally speaking, to want to continue to stay home with your parents. You're supposed to be breaking away from them. But do you want to go away and just completely forget them and have nothing to do with them? I realize there are some circumstances in which that may be true, but generally speaking, we don't want them, especially if we want them to continue to pay for stuff, right? Or bail us out of jail if we get arrested, which is where I was last Tuesday. I was in court with my son. You want the separation to have the space to do what you want to do and not have somebody looking over your shoulder. But you don't necessarily want to cut the tie. You like the protection, you like the money, you like being able to say you're part of this great empire in their case, but you don't necessarily want them to be right there in your face all the time. And that's the way I see the colonists. They like the idea that they were away from some of the rules and regulations, where England wasn't able to really hold them accountable for every little detail. But they surely didn't want to be independent. They didn't want to just completely break away and have nothing to do with it. And I think that we get that impression the way that this is all taught to us when we're young. That they came here to get away from England, and that is not what they were doing. Even when the revolution occurred, when we finally do declare our independence in 1776, it is still referred to as a minority revolution. Not minority in the sense of black, whatever, but a minority in the sense that, what's a majority? Most of the people, at least more than half. This was a minority revolution because you didn't have 50% or more of the people wanting to break away from it. The estimate is about 40% of people living in America actually wanted independence. That's one of the reasons why the revolution was so difficult, because they couldn't get the support of the people that lived in their towns themselves. They didn't know if the people living next door were going to turn them in or were going to support them. So the purpose of me asking you the question about the motivations of people coming here was to get you to see not only why they came, but also why they didn't come. And why it takes us so long before we finally do decide that independence is something that we do want. And then once we got it, a lot of people would say, why the hell did we do this? I mean, it was nice having a sugar daddy. It was nice having the great English Empire to support us if we got attacked. And now we're on our own. And Britain wasn't real nice to us after we defeated them in the American Revolution. They made life difficult for us in terms of trade and things like that. So there were definitely people who began to question the wisdom of what we had done even after we won the revolution. We'll talk more about that later on. All right, so Chapter 3, which is really what we should be covering today, but I felt like I wasn't here last week, so we need to kind of pull together some stuff in Chapter 2. In Chapter 3, it kind of throws a lot of stuff into Chapter 3. It talks about the origins of slavery, it talks about the economy that developed here, but it also talks about some of the first kind of intellectual and religious movements that took place in early America. So it's kind of cultural mixed in with some of the, just actual history stuff that's going on at that time as far as events taking place. But one of the things I wanted to talk about is slavery. We talked about the fact that you had indentured servants and then you got the shift to African slavery. African slaves, obviously, we all know, were not treated the same as indentured servants, at least not as time progressed. In the beginning, they might have been treated decently, but as time went on, there became a major distinction between the two. How would you characterize that distinction between an indentured servant and an African servant?
Indentured servants and they own free will basically. And slave ones, they were taken
Okay, so typically, not in all cases, but typically an indentured servant came voluntarily, and slave was captured and sold into slavery, okay? What else? How, from a white man's perspective, how did they view an indentured servant versus an African slave?
Slave was more, he had more property.
Yeah, that's the key I'm getting at. African slavery in America basically became to where that, what we would think of as a person, becomes a non-person. They become property. They are not human. So they don't treat them any differently than they would an animal. An animal that they might care about to a point, an animal that they might realize, like a horse, I got to take care of it, otherwise I don't have a horse that's going to carry me from one place to another. But not care about in the sense that they're human. That's the real difference with African slavery, is that the property became dehumanized. And you don't have that in all slavery throughout history. Some slaves have been treated quite well as slaves. Some slaves may still have been treated badly. They were considered to be lesser than the people that enslaved them, but they were still considered to be human. African slaves in America lost, for the most part, their humanity. They were not seen as a human being. Now, why would a white person, a godly white person, because most of these people living here in America at that time would consider themselves godly, why would they do that to another entity that looks just like them except for color? Why would you dehumanize that person? But how can they even be sinners if they're not human? Yeah, I think it's right. Kind of that time. That's the way I see it. Because if I am a godly person that is truly trying to live my life in a way that I think God would want me to, trying to please Him, how do I justify to myself that I'm owning another human being? But if I can tell myself that they're not human, then, it's no different than anything else. Now, if you care less, you don't care how brutal or cold you are, you don't need justification. But a lot of these people who own slaves consider themselves to be upstanding, godly people of their community. And I think it's hard for us to look back and say, how could you think that of yourself? How could you go to church every Sunday? How could you, try to live this godly life and yet you own all these slaves? But in their minds, they could justify it because they could see these people as not really being human. Which makes it easy. I mean, you guys are all relatively young, but as you get older, you find out just how great you become and rational. The things we choose to do, part of us knows a lot of times is wrong. And yet, we can come up with pretty good rationalizations as to why we're going to do it anyway. And I think the same thing is true here. They had to build a system to convince themselves that what they were doing was really not a bad thing. We'll get more into that later too. Talk about some other aspects of slavery. This chapter talks about not just slaves that were brought from North America, but the whole kind of Atlantic slave trade. Where did the majority of the slaves end up that were taken out of Africa? The Caribbean. The Caribbean and then Brazil. Brazil was a Portuguese colony and was a large colony that was also sugar cane was used there, or was grown there. So that becomes the major areas. Now, did anybody pick up on how many African slaves are thought to have been taken, or thought to have been brought to the New World?
11 million?
Okay, about 11 million is the estimate. We don't obviously have exact, we do have a lot of records, but we don't have precise records that would show us everything. Is that flashing all up there? Yes, ma'am. Right? Now it's blinking. So 10 to 12 million are said to have been brought to the New World. The percentage of those that came to the mainland is about what percent? Yeah, just 5%. Now, depending on what sources you look at, these numbers aren't always going to be exactly the same, but at least like here they say 4% was brought to British North America. But they're using 42% of all of the slaves were brought to the West Indies, Brazil 38%. And then this is showing kind of the area of Africa. Now keep in mind that this doesn't mean that there were not slaves taken from other parts of Africa. This is just where the coastal ports were. So a lot of times slaves would be captured inland and then marched to the coast and loaded on the boat. So it's not to say that slaves were only brought from here. It's just that's generally where the ports were located that they took them from. Now who generally did the slave raiding?
Other black tribes.
Other Africans. I mean, seriously, if you're white, are you going to get off your boat and march inland into Africa and start trying to capture? I mean, that would be kind of stupid. So they would stay on the coast and they would let the Africans, you know, they would offer money or other goods to the Africans, and they would be the ones who would march inland and capture people and bring them back to the coast. Now, keep in mind, Africans at this point in history enslaved other Africans. This is before the slave trade, just amongst themselves. They would enslave other Africans. So, how is that any different than the slavery that took place over here? They did not dehumanize them. They still could, they're the same race. They might be of different tribes, different languages, but they were of the same race. So they were still considered people, but they were usually captured in war. So when tribes would war against each other, the one who won got to take the other into slavery. They were, generally speaking, not treated as badly as slaves that were brought here. Even to the point that slaves could become like part of the family. You know, would fix the dinners and stuff, but then sit down with the family and eat with them, you know, when it came time for that. They could possibly earn their freedom after, I don't know exactly what was a certain number of years, but there were opportunities for them to become free. It wasn't necessarily permanent slavery. They also could be enslaved because of debt. If they weren't able to pay their bills, then they would have to, you know, almost like an indentured servant, they would have to become the person's servant so they would, in a sense, work that off. So it's a very different kind of slavery, but it's still slavery. I mean, there were definitely, you know, I conquered you, so now you have to become my slave. But they were not dehumanized. So the people who were captured and brought to the New World, even if they had seen slavery, had been slaves in Africa, what they experienced when they came here was very different probably than what they experienced back home. Now, we said 10 to 12 million were brought here. Did anybody see notes, I don't think it's in your textbook, in my notes, the estimates of how many Africans were lost because of the slave trade? Because 10 to 12 million actually made it here. But a lot of them were killed in the raids themselves, killed in the march to get them from inland to the coast, and then killed or died on the boats because they didn't survive the trip over. So did anybody see? I don't know about the percentage, but yeah, it is estimated. Now again, we can't prove this, but it is estimated that Africa may have lost 50 million people between those that actually arrived in America and those that died in the slave trading process. Because the money that, the goods and the money that was offered by the Europeans, I mean, there's a lot of, humans are greedy for the most part. And as the Africans were being offered these things, they became greedy. They wanted the stuff that Europe was offering them. And so the enticement of what they could get led to more conflicts in Africa and more wars amongst the tribes as they tried to conquer each other to be able to provide slaves to the Europeans. 50 million people, possibly, that were lost. Now, the slave trade, we can figure, is like 1500 to 1850. We're talking like a 350-year period. Now, the majority of that would have been between 1700 and 1800. That's when the slave trade was at its height. But if any of that is close to, reality, Brandon was talking about the percentage. What I do know, and I'm not sure, he could be correct, but what I do know is when this whole thing started in around 1500, Africa's share of the world population was about 15%. So of all the people in the world, in terms of what we can estimate from that time, their share of that was 15%. By the end of the African slave trade, Africa's population was only 8% of the total population of the world, which is about half of what it started. So it takes a lot of their people, but besides the fact that it takes a lot of their people, what people are being taken in the slave trade? Yeah. Are they taking 80-year-old men? No. I don't know how many 80-year-old men they looked in anyway, but they're not going to take the old men. They're not going to take the little tiny kids. They're not going to take weaklings. They're not going to take, wimpy people or people that are disabled. They're taking the young and strong out of Africa, generation after generation after generation for 300 years. The ones that are supposed, like you guys, the ones that are supposed to grow up to be our next leaders. God help us. Those people that are supposed to grow up to become the leaders of their tribes, to become the ones that are going to invent new things and explore new things and do the great stuff that you always hope for the next generation. That's who they take. Generation after generation, for 300 years, they do that to Africa. And then when it's all over with, when they finally say, oh, slavery's really a bad thing, we should have been doing that for 300 years, we should stop. When they finally stop, around 1850, what happens to Africa in the late 1800s? Sort of. European conquest of Africa. It's called imperialism. The late 1800s was a period in world history where all the major nations of the world felt that in order to be powerful and great, they had to conquer other nations. They had to have colonies. And Africa was prime for the picking because there was no organization, there was no political leaders because they'd been taking them for 300 years. And they came in and they just slowly, well actually not slowly, pretty quickly, just took all of Africa. Only 2 countries of Africa remained independent. Ethiopia and Liberia. The only 2 countries in all the continent of Africa that were able to maintain their independence. Every other part of Africa was carved up amongst the great European powers. The Germans, the Belgians, the English, the French, the Dutch. America basically didn't get it. we got in late. By the time we got involved, they had pretty much taken Africa. So we started on some other places. Like we tried to do Cuba, what worked for us. We got the Philippines, we got Puerto Rico, we got Guam, some other places like that. But Hawaii came under our control at that time. But they took Africa. They started to try to take Asia, but China balked at that, and they ended up kind of being able to hold their own over there. But all of Africa was taken over, and then it's not like they went in there and said, oh, let's try to build this place up after what we did to you for 300 years. They pretty much exploited them for the next 50 years. Using their workers, making their own people rich, the people who came in that actually became, the officials and leaders of the economy and everything, they got rich, but the workers all basically were exploited. That's where you get the whole thing in India with Gandhi and all that kind of stuff, and we're trying to resist British rule. So 300 years of the Atlantic slave trade, and then another 50 years of imperialism, maybe even longer than 50 years, depending on how we're dated. And then we get to World War II, and the Holocaust comes out, and everybody's like, oh my God, we had no idea this was happening. How could anybody treat these people this way? Of course, they're looking at themselves and saying, look at what we've done to the Africans. I mean, they did it to the Jews. They killed 6 million. We killed 50 million in Africa, and then exploited them for another 50 years. But then they do start to feel some guilt or something, and then they said, oh, we need to let these people go free. And all of a sudden, all of these African nations began to be given their independence. The problem was is that when the European powers came in and they took over these different areas, they took over areas that overlapped tribes. And it became a different nation, but it was a nation filled with all kinds of people that didn't necessarily like each other. So all their territorial boundaries were wrong that didn't match with the people who actually live in this particular area. And so once they were given their freedom, and the British, the French, the Germans, the Dutch all left, then what happened?
Usually about 500.
They all start
What
fighting
about
themselves
Britain
because they're living with
and
people
West?
that they don't
What am I
really
doing
like.
with them?
And they have very
50.
strong differences
Just
with
put
them.
it in 50.
So we
Okay.
wonder why Africa's always fighting. They still haven't quite figured out how to draw the territorial boundaries. And now, it all becomes about land and what else is over there. Such as diamonds.
All right, thank you.
You're not going to give up land because there's diamonds in, or that you think there's going to be diamonds in. I mean, I'm being somewhat simplistic, obviously, but a lot of what's going on in Africa today can be traced all the way back to this. It starts here. Because you can't just rape a continent for 300 years and then exploit them for another 50 or 70 years and then go, oh, you guys can be free now. I'll be generous. So be happy. What have you left them with to get started, to be able to have a decent life? So, the history, when we talk about the history of America and how things happened here, it's tied very closely with the history of lots of other things, and Africa being one of them. And the impact on Africa is huge with the Atlantic slave. And when people want to just, dismiss any kind of responsibility, I don't know what to do. I'm not saying, take out the car, $5. But we do, I do think we have to be held responsible. Not me personally, but our people have done this. You can't just say, oh, what happened a long time ago. I say that so many times. What would you say, when people talk about the Indians, right? The Indians are wanting reparations. They want to get paid for all the land that was stolen from them. And what is the majority of people's response to that today? What? It wasn't me, right? It happened a long time ago. I didn't do it. Now, you tell me if you would feel the same way if you knew that you had a 1,000-acre farm out west that was just literally taken from your great-grandpa, would you just be like, oh, well, it's a long time ago, it's okay. I mean, wouldn't you fight for it? That's your inheritance. You should be rich today. I mean, I don't think I would just go, how long time ago? No big deal. I think I'd be pissed. I mean, if I really knew that I could trace it back there and I had evidence that that was my land, and this whole thing, I mean, everybody's answer is, well, they have a casino. Do you know anything? There's hardly any of the Indians that are benefiting from those damn casinos. There's no, I mean, it's like such a small percentage of them. They're not sitting out there on those reservations with $1 million under their mattress. These people are poorer than dirt. They have nothing. They're the poorest group of people in America today. There's a very small percentage, just like the rest of us. I mean, I'm a white middle-class woman. I'm not wealthy just because I'm white. There's a very small group of white people in this country that are millionaires, right? The same thing is true in Native American. There's a small percentage of them that have made good money off the casinos. The majority of them are living lives that none of us would ever want to have to live for even 24 hours. They have a very difficult life. So, the casinos is not the answer to all of the Native American poverty in our country today. Well, again, it's that small percentage. You're right. I mean, and when we see that, we think, wow, look what they've got. You know what? Why is that?
Georgia's a lot different than Canada's otherwise.
It's just not that simple. People try to say they don't have to pay taxes. Anyway, racism and slavery. Did I ask you something? Hold on a minute. I don't think I did. I asked what happened after. Yeah. Which comes first? Racism or slavery? Did you say the second one? Next one? Slavery, the question is, does slavery lead to racism or does racism lead to slavery? It's an interesting question because you might think it's easy to answer that question in reference to America. But what if you think about other places that have slavery or that had slavery? Like I just said before, Africans enslaved other Africans. Does that have anything to do with racism? And that's the other thing. Keep in mind that racism, you can discriminate against somebody for reasons other than racism. Racism is not the only form of discrimination. I've had students in my online classes that will respond to that question. And the way that they respond to it, they seem to be confusing discrimination with racism, as if that's the only form of discrimination. In Africa, they can discriminate against each other just because they might say that that particular tribe practices some kind of ritual that we don't agree with. That's not racism. That might be for religious reasons they're discriminating against them, or they might see them as being of a lower class, and so they discriminate against them. But that's not the same thing as racism. So discrimination, racism is a form of discrimination, but it's not the only form. So when you're answering this question for your discussion board next week, think about that in terms of, make sure you're actually talking about racism and not just discrimination in general. Is racism always associated with slavery? I would say no. You could enslave somebody without being racist. So, in looking at that question, kind of think about other contexts in which you might find slavery and or racism. All right, one aspect of the whole Atlantic slave trade is part of what we call triangular trade. You guys talk about that? What? Yeah, I didn't expect it. There's a term that is used by historians. It's called triangular trade. Why do you think they use that term? What? Yeah. It kind of looks like a triangle, right? Okay, well, I know this is going to not be real clear, but here you've got, North America, South America, Africa, and Europe. Basically what they're talking about is a triangle, kind of a triangle anyway, that sort of involves Europe, Africa, and the Americas. So kind of put this together as one. So your triangle would be like here, to here, to here, and back, right? So the Americas in general are what would that be called? Top of triangle? The apex? If that's the apex, and then you go over here, and this is your base, so you've got a point there and a point there, and then it comes back to the apex. So that's the triangle that they're referring to. Now, the point is, you have to keep in mind that this is not very clear, clean, simple. It's not like it always follows the same path, like, here to here, and back, and up there. It doesn't always follow that way. Stuff kind of goes back and forth this way. Stuff might go back and forth this way, this way. It doesn't always follow all three legs of the triangle. But the point is that what is being taken from America? But raw materials for the most part, resources that are being taken from America. And what is America getting? Slaves, and what else? Manufactured products. So we don't manufacture hardly anything here in the 1600s, even in the beginning of the 1700s. We're not making much ourselves. So we have to buy our finished products from Europe for the most part. So that's what this is talking about, manufactured goods coming this way. But as you can see, the raw materials are going that direction. Grain, iron, tobacco, rice, indigo, all of those kinds of things. Also from the Indies, obviously sugar going that way, but also rum. There is some rum being distilled over here. But you can, see from the different arrows and the direction that they're going, the kinds of things that are going one direction or another. But this is what's referred to as the triangular trade. Involving the Americas, Europe, and Africa. Now, what is the Middle Passage? The slave trade, but how does it fit into this? So it's one leg of the triangular trade, right? So that's why they call it the Middle Passage, because it's the middle of the, supposedly, whoever came up with that, it doesn't always work that way, but supposedly it's the middle of the leg, the second leg of the triangle. It doesn't always work that way, but that's why they first named it that. So when somebody refers to the Middle Passage, they're referring to the ships that are coming over loaded with slaves. Now, was that a fun voyage for this slave? Go party in a whole good ship? What? Yeah, there's that. Bounce around on a ride, fun. obviously a horrible experience for them, something really that I truly can't imagine to go through something like that, because they could be in the hold of that ship. I mean, they would be brought up on top. It's not like they were down underneath the whole time, because they would bring them up to give them some fresh air, to let them walk around a little bit, get some exercise and stuff like that. But you're held in the bottom of that ship for 8 to 12 weeks. And they tended to pack them in pretty tightly. Most of the time, the picture, what is that page on there? Page 78 kind of shows you an artist rendering of what it might have looked like. And then also on 79, I think there's another illustration. But they usually, they were like put on shelves. And these shelves that they were put on usually were not more than 18 to 24 inches. So you definitely couldn't stand, and most of the time you couldn't even sit up. You had to lay down when you were on these shelves because there was not enough room to sit up. Now some of them there show that there's enough room to sit up, but that wasn't always the case. And you were usually chained to at least one person next to you, sometimes both people on either side of you. Probably the worst of it is that, you're on a ship going across the ocean. I don't know about the rest of you, but many people do get seasick. And when you get seasick, you tend to throw up. And when you're throwing up in this circumstance, you're probably throwing up on yourself as well as other people around you. And people would get sick and have bowel troubles, and so they would have that as well on themselves and people around them. And these are not cushioned shelves. I mean, they're just slabs of wood, so they're holes. So if you're having problems, you're probably doing that on the people that are below you. The stench of these places is, I just couldn't even imagine. And then people on top of that are actually getting sick of stuff that they're going to die from. It's not just sick of their stomach, but they're coming down with diseases, and that gets spread throughout the ship. So the conditions under which they had to travel, the heat or the cold, depending on what time of year, what kind of weight of people you travel with, the stench, the illness, the fear, they didn't know where they were going. They didn't know what was going to happen. It's not like people who had this had happened to could write back and say, oh, this is what's going on over here, guys. You might want to kind of watch out. Most of the time, they didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know what they were being carried into. And if the ship runs low on provisions, there's not enough food to feed people. The ones who start getting weak and seem to start having problems, you just dump them overboard. A burden on the resources that you have left. I mean, it really has to be one of the most horrendous experiences anybody could ever live through. It's not like, I mean, almost anybody could do something for a few days. If you knew it was going to end soon. But to have this go on week after week for 8, 10, 12 weeks, I think I would be tempted to do it. Some of them did. And they would just rather die in the ocean than continue to go through. I mean, that's the other part about knowing that they truly didn't see the machine. Now, the masters are not the ones generally doing this. The ones who would end up buying the slaves are not the ones doing this. These people were definitely in it for the money. This is all about profit. Human beings are capable of most cruelty in the world, I think. Kind of like unleashing middle school students on the world. You ever known anybody in this world? That's still next part. Salem witch trials, why'd they happen?
Female they had, I thought it was know, they had told a story about, or made up a story about West Indian females practicing voodoo. And then come to find out it was just a story that being told. But that started.
So why, I mean, if somebody told me that story, I wouldn't still tell them to believe it. Why were they not united? What were the divisions that were taking place in Salem at this time? Well, there's two different things you guys have said there. You said what? Yeah, you've got these women who don't seem to fit the gender roles because who lives in Salem? What? Puritans for the most part, right? And Puritans very much believed in, you know, the women have a certain place. You know, the man is in charge, the woman has to be submissive, all that kind of stuff. So you've got these women that are not fitting into that. They're more outspoken, they might not have a husband, so they have to kind of run their own lives, and you're not supposed to do that as a woman, you're supposed to be under some male authority. So you've got that issue where they seem to be going against the gender roles that are accepted in Puritan communities. But you were referring to what else? And income. At this point in the 1690s, there seemed to have been a disparity in income in Salem, where you had some groups that had become relatively wealthy or at least well off, and then you've got a group that's poor. The accusations seem to have been coming more from the poorer people, who they think might have been bitter, resentful that they weren't doing as well as the other group. Okay, so you've got these conditions, which means that they don't have a nice, cohesive, unified community anymore, which is what Puritans think that they're supposed to have. You know, everybody's supposed to be on the same page, we're all happy, we're all serving God, and yet now we've got all this stuff going on that doesn't fit what we think is proper Puritan community behavior. So, if we get resentful about people being better off than us, we then go hang out with them. Right? Is that what you would do? So, I mean, why was that the result? I mean, just because you think some women are not behaving properly, or some people are wealthier than you and you're ticked off at, you're going to go call them a witch and then go hang them? I mean, how does that happen? Yeah, I mean, you have to add that to that, because you can't, I mean, people don't do something like that unless they truly believe that there's evil in the world, that the devil has the ability to do these things. So when you tie all of that together, you know, their belief system that in their mind, in their worldview, this is real. I mean, we kind of laugh at it almost, but to them, this was real stuff. They believed that the devil could actually make contact with people, and then, you know, they can enter into these bargainous relationships with the devil, and he can make them do stuff like that. So with that worldview, those kind of religious beliefs, and then you throw into that these factors of discontent, I mean, that's a dangerous situation. I mean, in some ways, it's not a whole lot different. I mean, what is something similar to that you guys experience in your life?
You never called me love, never called it.
That's not your lifetime. That's my lifetime. I was trying to think of something a little closer to your own. But, yeah, after 9/11, anybody that you saw that looked like they could be from Iraq, you know, most of the people know where Iraq is, but they look different than us, right? You know, they must be a terrorist. I mean, people would try to get on airplanes in our country, and, you know, they were pulled off and went through a lot more than we all have to do that now. Take off the shoes, belt, you know, pretty much strip you there in the airport now before they let you in the airplane. But Yeah, we all have to go through some of that, but some of these people were detained for long periods of time before they would let them fly, because, just because of the way they look. Because all of a sudden, everybody like that must be a terrorist. Funny thing, one of mine was first day class, was a young man, but very lucky. I think he was from Iran, turned out. But I was calling roll and stuff, and he was kind of at the bottom of the list. And I got down to that. And called him. And I went on and stuff, and I looked up and said, "Are you a terrorist?" The whole class. I mean, he was fine. It got dead quiet, and their eyes were like this big. And I mean, they could not believe that I was taking it. But I went on, obviously, to make a point. This is probably right down back and forth. It's a lot closer.
We ended up having a really interesting discussion about how, you know, we try to pride ourselves on going all democratic in America. We turned very quickly after 9/11. We went out to the only other thing that I had on my list that I hope to get to today was, I think, the last question dealing with the Great Awakening. How many of you, on a scale of 1 to 10, would
say that you are religious, like, at the upper end, like 8 to 10 range? Okay, typically, people, you know, in our society today, even people that believe in God and stuff like that, they don't, there's not that many people that would self-identify as being extremely religious. And I think that makes it hard for us to understand something like the Great Awakening in this country. I mean, this was truly a revival that didn't just happen in a church, but it swept the colony. I mean, it spread from the top to the bottom. And people were changed. They changed their lives in response to this movement that was taking place. And the people that were sort of the instigators of it were the great preachers of that time. The one in particular was the traveling evangelist, George Whitefield. His name looks like Whitefield, but he pronounced it. George Whitefield came from Britain, and he traveled throughout the States. Apparently was just an amazing spellbinding speech. Ben Franklin and he became very good friends, even though their religious beliefs were extremely different. And Franklin found him to be just the most amazing orator he'd ever heard.